Good evening. I'm Jeffrey Quilter, director of the Peabody Museum. Welcome to our last talk of, well, we think it's just a year. And given the fact that there are apocalyptic concerns, we decided to invite one of Harvard's own to talk to us about it, a Mesoamerican specialist to boot. David Carrasco is a Mexican-American historian of religions and the Neil Rutenstein Professor of Latin America, holding positions in both the Department of Anthropology and the Divinity School. He has a particular interest in religious dimensions of human experience, especially Mesoamerican cities as symbols, immigration, and the Mexican-American borderlands. He studied with Mircea Eliade, Charles H. Long, and Paul Wheatley at the University of Chicago, who inspired him to work on the question, where is your sacred place? On the challenges of post-colonial ethnography and theory, and on the practices and symbolic nature of ritual violence in comparative perspective. Working with Mexican archaeologists, he's carried out 20 years of research in the excavations and archives associated with the sites of Teotihuacan and Mexico Tenochtitlan. He's participated in spirited debates at Harvard with Cornel West and Samuel Huntington on the topics of race, culture, and religion in the Americas. This has resulted in publications on ritual violence in sacred cities, religion and transculturation, the Great Aztec Temple, and the history of religions in Mesoamerica and Latina religions. Recent collaborative publications include Breaking Through Mexico's Past, Digging the Aztecs with Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, and Cave City and Eagle's Nest, an interpretive journey through the Mapa de Quatinchan, #2, gold winner of the 2008 Pub West Book Design Award in the academic book non-trade category. It was also recently featured in the New York Review of Books. His work has included a special emphasis on the religious dimensions of Latino experience, mestizaje, the myth of Aztlan, transculturation, and the Virgin of Guadalupe. He's co-producer of the film Alambrista, the director's cut, which puts a human face on the life and struggles of undocumented Mexican farm workers in the United States. And he edited Alambrista and the U.S.-Mexico border, film, music, and stories of undocumented immigrants. He is editor-in-chief of the award-winning 3-volume Oxford Encyclopedia of Mesoamerican Cultures. His most recent publication is a new abridgment of Bernal Diaz de Castillo's memoir of the Conquest of Mexico, History of the Conquest of New Spain. Carrasco has received the Mexican Order of the Aztec Eagle, the highest honor the Mexican government gives to a foreign national. And it's a pleasure to know him personally as well. So would you please join me in the end of the world, but the beginning of David Carrasco. Thank you.
We've had our first snafu. It's supposed to be images on both sides in these other screens. That doesn't mean it's an apocalypse, but it means something. And perhaps the technician will come back and fix this. So I'd like to express my thanks to Professor Quilter for this introduction and wish him well in his new leadership here at the Peabody Museum. The Peabody Museum, in my view, is one of the real treasures of the Harvard campus. People don't realize that just because it's an old building doesn't mean that there's old thoughts going on here. And I think that Jeff and the staff here have to be given special recognition for the everyday work that they do to make the educational experience at the Peabody Museum really top-notch for students. And I think they deserve all the support that we can give them. I'd like to also thank the Peabody for inviting me to be part of this divination lecture series. And I'd like to thank Pamela Girardi and Faith Sutter for their support along the way. Almost 30 years ago, the world-famous historian of religions and novelist, Mircea Eliade, gave a standing room-only lecture in the Glenn Miller Ballroom at the University of Colorado entitled Waiting for the Dawn. Apropos of our topic tonight, here are the opening words of that lecture given in October of 1982. Eliade said, "It has been remarked that one paradox characteristic of our post-war period is the coexistence of a tragic, neurotic pessimism with a robust, almost candid optimism. A great number of scientists, sociologists, and economists draw increasing attention to the imminent catastrophes which menace our world. Not only our Western type of culture and socio-political institutions, but mankind in general, and even life on our planet. On the contrary, other authors, less numerous but equally energetic, exalt the great scientific discoveries and fantastic technological conquests accomplished or underway in recent decades." Eliade said, although they approach subjects from opposing positions, these thinkers illustrate different aspects of the same cultural process, the conviction that we are witnessing the end of our world and are thus on a threshold of some decisive event, either a total extinction or the beginning of a new creation. Eliade, the author of such great works as The Myth of the Eternal Return, Sacred and Profane, Myths, Dreams, and Mysteries, Shamanism, as well as Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom, as well as the novels The Forbidden Forest and Isabel and the Devil's Waters, went on in the 1982 lecture to give numerous examples in his time of apocalyptic thought and action. He spoke of American and European youth's exaltation of rock music, the Blue Oyster Cult, and Don't Fear the Reaper, Bob Dylan's Blowing in the Wind and A Hard Rain is Gonna Fall, The Doors, the French group Magma, science fiction writing, A Plan to Save the Tropical Forests, Robert Heilbrunner's An Inquiry into the Human Prospect, where he talks about the dangers of overreaching the thermal limit for the atmosphere. And Eliade read the terrifying sentence from the Plan to Save the Tropical Forests that went, "The tropical rainforests are the world's rich gene banks, and as they start to disappear, so do our options for the future. It is just like walking along a plank and starting to cut away at the wood behind us with a saw. If a culture sins against the forest, its biological decline is inevitable. 60 million years of evolution is being converted into worthless paper packaging," he wrote. He also referred to the great theologian Teilhard de Chardin and his conception of the cosmic Christ, where Chardin said, "Love is the affinity which links and draws together the elements of the world. Love, in fact, is the agent of a universal synthesis." He also spoke, Eliade, in his lecture, of Arthur Clarke's prediction of encounters with extraterrestrial beings, the construction of a world brain, and man's immortality by the year 2100. At one point in the lecture, Eliade quoted this passage from Christian Vander's group Magma in a cut called Mechanique Destructive Commando. "The creatures of rage, the choirs, the music of iron and ice, the shrill shrieks which sketch the inextinguishable apocalypse, these creatures of rage who come to smash the earth to powder and sweep away the multitudes, and the immeasurably putrid chaos of our world is delivered up to the angels of darkness who come to punish the insane pride of the earthlings." That certainly sounds like angry people to me. I introduced this lecture on the apocalypse with ample comments from Mircea Eliade to make 2 points. First, human concerns and fears of the end of time or apocalypse have for some time been a widespread, ever-present concern among human beings, and not only in the Western world. If you go back 30 years before Eliade's lecture to 1952, we find that in that year, President Truman revived his ratings with a State of the Union speech focused on the claim that America was in its greatest peril from the communist aggressions all around the world. If you go back 30 years before that to 1922, you find that, well, the apocalypse was everywhere for someone. A typhoon hit Shantou, China, killing more than 50,000 people. If you go back 20 years before that to 1892, the Sierra Club was formed by John Muir in San Francisco for the conservation of nature. A mine explosion killed 100 people in Krebs, Oklahoma, and black people trying to help rescue white survivors were driven away with guns. If you go back and back, you'll see that apocalyptic fears about nature, race, and the economy, well, they're always with us. The second point in bringing Eliade to us at the beginning is to say that the fear of apocalypse, soon or waiting for the dawn, always seems to fluctuate between a fearful negative view of the immediate future and a hopeful positive view of the immediate future and the world we live in now. We can all identify, I think to some extent, with the natural disasters of Hurricane Sandy and its impact on our consciousness, the tsunami that hit the Japanese islands in Katrina, and some of us, clearly a small majority, expressed a sense of renewal with the recent election of Barack Obama. Of course, some will say that it means the end is ever closer. In what follows, I want to lead us on a tour, a comparative discussion of apocalypse now, a tour of apocalyptic and millennial themes and movements found in 3 traditions, Native American or Mesoamerican traditions. But I want to make it clear that in doing this, I'm not favoring the Maya, so-called Maya prophecy. This is the closest I can get to divination and the Maya calendar. You know, this lecture is in a series on divination. And so here you see a moment of divination showing up. And I think this is about as good as the scholars and the popular people have gotten to divining that the Maya calendar actually predicts an end of the world, because I think what we know now is that none of that is true, and we'll talk about that during this lecture. I want to talk about another culture that in fact does have a cosmology that did predict the end of the world repeatedly over and over again through a discussion of the Aztec calendar stone. And I certainly want to talk about where apocalyptic language and interpretation comes from, which is from the Christian tradition, the Jewish Christian tradition that is found in the book of Revelation. Here you have an image from El Greco of the opening of the 5th seal of the apocalypse. And moving into an area where people don't think of apocalyptic thinking, I want to, if I have time, talk about the apocalypse in Buddhism, and especially the concept of Mapo, or the declining age that we are all living in now, according to some people in the Buddhist tradition. At the end, I want to talk about a new book, a children's book that my daughter and I have written as a kind of rejoinder to all of this talk about the Maya apocalypse in a book called Mysteries of the Maya Calendar Museum. And that should be a lot of fun. But as a way of trying to help us, I'd like to talk a little bit first at the beginning about an apocalyptic pattern. You have all this language going on in academia and also in the public sphere about apocalypse. But what is apocalypse and what does it mean? Well, historians of religions like Eliade and many anthropologists have studied these kind of movements all over the world, and they've come up with a kind of pattern that can help us understand what it could be meant by apocalypse and apocalyptic movements. And I'd just like to talk about them a little bit so that when we look at these other traditions, we can sort of evaluate them from a kind of protocol to see if in fact we do see evidence of apocalypse or is something else going on. So people who've looked at these different types of movements and these texts will first of all say that in order for it to really be an apocalyptic movement, there's got to be a message that has appeared in a vision or a dream. It's usually given to a prophet or someone who becomes a prophet. You're not really talking much about apocalypse unless there's this vision until there's this moment of a dream. This vision usually communicates that there's a transformation and it's coming very soon. As a matter of fact, if you believe in the Maya, it's 23 days from now, so you better get things straight in your own life. So the message is that there's an imminent transformation, and the imminent transformation is this worldly. It's going to affect us on this world, on this level of the cosmos. It's going to be terrestrial. It's going to affect your everyday life. And the signs of it are usually that this world is in decline. There's all kind of signs around us that the world is in decline. There's danger. There's a high increase in human suffering, says the prophet, who has gotten the message in a dream about an imminent transformation. It's very important to understand that in apocalyptic movements, the transformation is understood to be a total transformation. It's not just a transformation over there in East Boston. It's happening everywhere. And the idea that the prophet tells you is that it's not just your neighborhood, it's the whole universe. And so there's this sense of urgency, there's a sense of totality, and there's also a sense that the message has come from another level of reality to us. It's very important, I think, because when I read some of this literature in preparation for this lecture on the so-called Maya prophecy, even among some of the scholars, I don't think they really understand what prophecy means. Prophecy doesn't mean a prediction in the future. To get a prophecy means you have received a message that comes from outside of you, from another level of the world, and it's come into your mind, and you're not making a prediction, you're carrying forth a message that has come from the gods, the ancestors, spirits, animals, or some other place. And what they claim is that there's a total transformation. Now, in my scholarship, I always like to focus on the city, and so what you'll see in a number of these traditions, in fact, all of the ones that we look at tonight, is that there's always an emphasis on a city as the concrete example of the place where the transformation is taking place, where there has been this message delivered. It doesn't always have to be a city, but often the city is emphasized. This is another thing that's really interesting when you look at apocalyptic movements around the world, is people got all these numbers. And you'll see those numbers showing up tonight. And it's not just the Maya who have all these many numbers. The Christians have the numbers, the Buddhists have the numbers, the Aztecs have the numbers. And these numbers are viewed as sacred numbers, as themselves a part of the revelation, a part of the message. And it allows then people in the community to go around and detect where there is a sign or a moment where these numbers are showing themselves. Often it has become that there's a catastrophe. Now, the catastrophe for some people, especially in minority communities who get involved in these movements, they'll say, look, the catastrophe already happened. The catastrophe happened to us because we're black and we were slaves. Or the catastrophe happened to us because we were Jews and the temple was destroyed. And then some say, well, there's another catastrophe coming. And the catastrophe coming is going to get the people who gave us our catastrophe. And it's not only going to get them, it's going to be a total catastrophe. Now, not all apocalyptic movements push the catastrophe hard, but it's very interesting to see how different versions of a catastrophe are part of this message of an imminent transformation that is this worldly, total, that you can detect by numbers, and then in fact leads either to a golden age or a period of travail. So let's really begin where we should when we talk about apocalyptic thinking in the Western world. While many of us in this room, this is where John of Patmos, who was the author of Revelation, has a great vision, but while many of us in this room will think of Apocalypse Now or Apocalypse Soon in terms of Francis Ford Coppola's great film about the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, few of us know that the word apocalypse is from the Greek apocalypsis, which originally meant, and this is very important in terms of why I have such a problem with some of this so-called Maya apocalypse thought. It has to do, the word means uncovering some sort of hidden meaning. It means a revelation of a highly enigmatic or mysterious message that's often brought or interpreted by a charismatic figure. It's a revelation of something hidden. It's an unmasking. It's an unmasking of something. We think the world as we know it is real. That's the mask. And all of a sudden this mask is taken off in a dream or in a vision, and the person comes to understand what's behind the mask. And what's behind the mask is really what's real and what's in the future. This is what the word revelation means. This charismatic figure, he may not have been charismatic before he got the vision, but after he gets the vision, he becomes charismatic, a prophet, a seer, a shaman. He warns of the end of the world, of Judgment Day, of the reversal of cosmic orders. One of the big symbolisms in many of these movements is reversal, the reversal of the status quo, where the low becomes high and the high becomes low. Those who are on the left will be on the right, and so forth. This is the way that it's often thought of. One of the persons who has written a great deal about this recently is Elaine Pagels. And in talking about this book of Revelations in the Bible, it'd be interesting. Let me ask, how many people here have actually read the book of Revelations? Okay, some of you. No, that's not a great record, but it's okay. But it's all right, because according to Elaine Pagels, quote, it's the strangest book in the Bible. It's the most controversial. She writes, it's a book of furious images, of wonder, violence, nightmares, darkness and sleep, of interior dreams. And all of that for this Jewish community that really produced the book of Revelation, all of that was a source of thought, not just a source of fear. All of those dreams and nightmares and nighttime worryings becomes a resource for thinking and a resource for theology. Theology just doesn't come out of university studies. They often come out of these troubled times within people. And she's talking about it in this way. I like this image by El Greco because it shows a very important point about the book of Revelation, and that is, even though it was this strange book, weird book really, the last book to get into the Bible, it's had a tremendous influence through history. It's had a tremendous influence through history. Milton, Yeats, James Baldwin, films and painters. Here El Greco is showing you a moment in the book of Revelation, and you get a sense here of what I mean when I talk about this pattern of some sort of vision or so forth. Here you see this opening, and you get a sense of the light and the sky. The fact that people are appearing nude and they've been reduced to their basic humanity. There's this sense of wonder and awe. There's a child who appears, new life appears at the opening of this fifth seal. What Elaine Pagels says in her study is that up till now, people, perhaps not those of you in the room, claim that these visions are being fulfilled before their very eyes. And she says, quote, the popularity of the book of Revelation speaks to something deep in human nature. It always feels very relevant to who we are. The other thing about this book that's very important in terms of apocalyptic movements is that the book of Revelation is about these marginal folks, these outsiders. At the beginning of the story, they're persecuted, they're losers, they're people on the periphery. But it's the story about how this vision and their community eventually becomes the insider religion, becomes the successful religion. So even though it's not an apocalyptic reversal, over time this message works its way into the official documents of the new Christian tradition and the empire that it becomes. Today, as we know, the word apocalypse is commonly used in reference to any prophetic revelation or so-called end-time scenario, and to the end of the world in general. And this book set the pattern both within the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, and in many other traditions, especially in colonized communities, where the book was taken. What often happened in Africa, in Latin America, and some other places, when the Christians came in with this book, and they came in with this story, local people would pick it up. People who weren't Christians, who were becoming Christians, they'd pick up, and they'd often turn to this book. As Roberto Mata is showing us in his research, they'd often turn to this book because of this revolutionary, wild kind of story that the world could be transformed and turned upside down, where the outsiders, through their anger and through their fury and through their commitments, could somehow bring about a change in the world. What I'd like to do is to just show you one passage from the book of Revelation, so you can get a sense of how this pattern that I opened up with is present there. And you can also get a sense of how some of the language from the Christian apocalypse, the Jewish Christian apocalypse, how this gets picked up and becomes attractive to us. So here's some lines from chapter 21. where you have this notion of I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Now what is impressive to me about this is he's not saying I thought about a new heaven and a new earth. He's not saying I dreamed it up. So I saw it. In other words, it was an experience. It was something that my body took into itself. And what I saw was amazing. It was a new heaven and a new earth. And the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. And these are very important if you want to talk about a real apocalyptic movement, because you've got to have the energy through your vision to really bring about and claim for a change. Not that you think about or ponder or I'm going to write an exam about. No, I saw it. And it was a new heaven and a new earth. And the other one was gone. Now, of course, he's seen something in the future. So he's seeing it in the future. Now, that's a lot of good seeing. He's not just predicting it. He's seeing it. It's a tactile experience, something that's there. And here comes that city. And he says, I, John, what did I see? Well, I saw a city. I saw a new Jerusalem, a holy city. Not just any city. I saw the holy city. The city that today is the focus of our Islamic community, of the Christian community, of the Jewish community. This is the center of the world. He saw the center of the world coming down from God, out of heaven. So he's seeing an amazing thing. This is what I mean by what a prophecy is. This is the vision, and it's a radical vision. And it's very interesting that you immediately have a notion of a kind of a family, of a husband and a wife, of a new union, of a hieros gamos, of the sky and the earth coming together. So this is the kind of vision that you have that's apocalyptic. And throughout Christian art, you see this. Here's an image of the city of Jerusalem coming to earth from heaven. It's again my city, it's a place. So this idea of an apocalyptic emotional transformation, it's always this notion of a place. Structures, buildings themselves where people can dwell, architecture. There's an architecture to this particular vision. Again, you see it here with the walls, the angel itself giving John of Patmos the message of this. It goes on, it says, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying. So what's this about? Well, it's about a lot of things, but it's about human suffering. This is why it appeals to so many people, because it's about human suffering. It's the end of human suffering. So what's the apocalypse mean? This is not what you're hearing about the Maya. It's about the end of human suffering. And how will it be? How will it end? God will wipe it away. God himself will take away the suffering. He'll wipe away these tears, and there shall be no more death. Even death will be overcome, and sorrow. Now, this is from a community. This is from a community that's been suffering a lot of death. More death than it needed to renew itself. More sorrow. And you can imagine the appeal of this to people in colonial situations as well as any of us, because there'll be no more pain in the future. And he sat upon the throne and said, behold, I make all things new. And he said unto me, this is very important in terms of what you're going to see in all of these traditions that we look at tonight. Write the vision. Write it down. In other words, spread the word. This is not a vision just for you. It's not even one just to be preached. There's something that's got to be written down, because these are the true words. These are the faithful words. This is scripture. So this man has received this, and what you've got to do is you've got to write it down. And it's very important, because you'll see in many traditions the role of scribes and the power of writing in this. And then you get this very famous phrase, it's done. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give unto him that is athirst of the fountain of the water of life freely, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. Two things here. In other words, you don't need anything else. I'm the beginning and I'm the end. This is the total transformation that I'm giving to you that is imminent. And then they have this notion of, again, family, father and son. Before you have a marriage, now you have a father and son. So it also speaks to this kind of social situation. I'm not saying every apocalyptic movement has this, but it's important if we're going to talk about apocalypse that we also at least pay some attention to this. And there's some other scholars in the audience, some colleagues of mine from the Divinity School who can help us with this in ways that I can't. Now, one of the things I wanted to let you know about is how does this come to us? Well, it comes to us, this vision of apocalypse comes to us certainly through the Christian church and many of its teachings and preachings, but this is a figure you ought to know about if you want to consider how some of these ideas have made it into secular and religious thinking leading up till today. Joachim of Fiore, a very important monk, a very important writer, who is living during these years, called the most singular and fascinating figure of medieval Christianity. He appears in Dante's Paradise as a figure that Dante looked up to and revered. He lives at a time what scholars have called the turning point, which was the 12th century. This was the time of the Crusades and the conquest of the Normans. In other words, this is another element about a lot of apocalyptic thinking, at least in terms of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's often about warfare. It's in the time of war. And it's in a time that is almost a kind of warfare literature. So during the time of Joachim of Fiore, who takes this apocalyptic tradition out of the Judeo-Christian tradition and moves it forward in history, you also have a time of great upheaval and schisms in the Catholic Church. So Joachim, now he's part of something I think shows up in the Aztec and Maya community, certainly in the Buddhist community as well, and that is a lot of this comes out of monastic life, comes out of these monasteries. And these monasteries, during the time of Joachim of Fiore and Bernard of Clairvaux, these are people, both men and women, but in this case men, who are spending a lot of time reading the Bible. And when they're reading the Bible, they're finding themselves having these little whammy experiences with reading the Bible. And they're talking to one another. And Bernard of Clairvaux, he develops this method called the Lectio Divina, you know. And this is something we'd like to see our students feel a little bit more of. When you read a book, it's not just for the information. The idea is that it's alive. It's alive on the page. And you got to be able to read between the lines for the life that is in the page. Because what's in the page is really this divine word, this message for anyone who can see it. And so this abbot here, he picks this up. And here comes some of the numbers. And he develops a tremendous sort of vision of history itself, all of history as being in three stages, really Christian history being in three stages. Big numbers showing up here. First of all is this age of the Father. He reads the Bible and he sees that there's this age of the Father that is now past. And this is when people were obedient to the mankind, to the rules of God. There's another age that he discovers in the Bible. This is the age of the Son. That's between Christ and 1260, because he thinks in 1260 that's the big year. That's the big year. That's his big year, and that's up to that point. Human beings really were the Son of God, but now we've entered the age of the Holy Spirit. Now, the reason I'm telling you about this is because this guy's ideas, they get picked up big time in European society, not just by religious people, but many secular people. This tripartite view of history gets picked up in Marxism. It gets picked up in a number of other social theories, even though they may not be talking about the religious meaning. They pick up on Joachim of Fiore's notion, and the notion is that just around the corner is we'll be in direct contact with God. We'll reach the total freedom preached by the Christian message. And throughout his writing, numbers are real big. He used symbols to lay out the theology of history, the number 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, 12, what's left. Is also used to organize everyday reality, but he's saying, in my lifetime, just around the corner, there's going to be this big change in the world, and we are going to really experience God's presence through us, especially if we can get people to read the Bible this way, says Joachim of Fiore. And he's an artist. He writes this. He paints it. Here's the three stages of history, and you can see that they're all intertwined in some way. They're connecting, but as you move toward this period of the Holy Spirit, where people are really going to know God face to face, they are still connected to the other two, but you really want to be in that third one. There's also this number 7, and what he does is he lays out something that's also very important in apocalyptic thinking: the adversary. you're really not going to have an apocalyptic movement anywhere unless there's an adversary. Something else rather missing in this Maya discussion. There's always an adversary in this real apocalyptic thinking. And this is the seven-headed serpent, and actually each of them is related to one of the popes or someone else in Catholic history that he's against. So the seven is not just a vague number. There's specific people, institutions are getting picked on, are getting noted in order for people to understand what we're up against, in order to bring about this great change. Now, all of this, and of course there's a great deal more, all of this prophecy of the book of Revelation and also Joachim of Fiore, this is very important in terms of how people in Europe came to see the Maya and the Aztecs. Because this vision that I've been laying out for you, it comes to Mexico and it comes to the Caribbean with the very first Franciscans who arrived, because they're coming right out of this tradition of Joachim of Fiore. In a wonderful book called The Millennial Kingdom of the Franciscans in the New World, John Liddy Phelan lays this out in a chapter called Apocalypse in the Age of Discovery. And what you find is that when Europeans came to Mexico, especially from the church, they were carrying with them this apocalyptic thought that somehow the third age was them in the New World. And if they could just get the Aztecs and the Maya and these other people to be baptized with their saliva, to genuflect in this way, to become Christians, at least baptized as Christians, then in fact there could be this apocalypse that would be a wonderful apocalypse, and in fact Jesus would come back. And if you read this book, you can see I'm not talking about a minority of these people, I'm talking about the majority of them were perceiving indigenous priests, were these indigenous people in this way. So I wanted to make sure that when we move now into the Native American, the people in the Americas, I wanted you to get a sense of what apocalyptic language means, and also this is what impacts them, this is what comes to them, and some of them begin to see themselves as indigenous people in this way as well. So part 2, the Maya apocalypse, not soon. In preparing for this talk, I looked at a lot of cartoons. There's a lot of cartoons. And it's going to freak somebody out someday. It certainly is freaking them out now. Here's another one, literally translated. It says, "We're toast" in 2012, as they look over here. So here we are in the time of the so-called Mayan prophecy. We've had Anthony Avini come here several times. We've got T-shirts you can get. Dates, numbers are showing up. These numbers are very important on this side of the... But to me, this reminds me, this cultural fascination with the Maya ending date reminds me of a similar fascination with the Death of God movement in the 1960s. Time magazine got caught up in this and put the question on one of its covers. A handful of Protestant theologians, they were mainly Protestant theologians, made a big splash by interpreting the post-war shifts in church attendance and theological thinking as signs that God had died in Western culture. Insightful commentators noted that what was coming to an end was what Paul Tillich called the Protestant era. People had confused the weakening of the cultural influences of Protestantism with the notion that God was dying. It was a particular God or people's conception of God that was undergoing reduction of power and influence. And the New York came up and said, well, maybe it means that America is dead in some way. Of course, Nietzsche, years before, had said that God was dead, but it looks like God got the last word when he said that Nietzsche was dead. And so the question is, who wins in these apocalypses? You have to be careful when you go around claiming that God is dead. But let's just say a little bit something about the Maya, because I know some of you are here to hear that, although other people have given better lectures than I can give on the Maya. We know that research has taught us that the Maya, well, they had many calendars, but there were 3 calendars in particular. There was this Solkin, the divinatory calendar of 260 days. There was the Hab, the administrative solar calendar of 360 days with 5 dangerous days, which is very important. But the one that's got everybody freaked out is the long count, it's cumulative. And the long count really is a count that imagines a cosmic creation that happened long ago, on the date is calculated as August 11, 3114 BC. Long count means that since that time, there have been 13 cycles of 144,000 days, with the 13th ending in 23 days from now on December the 21st, 2012. Now, does this constitute or mark an apocalyptic moment or event in either Maya thinking or prophecy? That's the question. And there have been conferences all over the country about this, and all the scholarship says no. All the scholarship says that there was no prophecy in any of the surviving glyphs or documents that suggest that the Maya thought that this was going to be some sort of catastrophe in their world or anybody's world. But today, there's more than 1,500 books that can be purchased online or from local bookstores claiming that the Maya prophesied an apocalypse. More than 1,500 of these books. It's been well researched. A recent publication from the Journal of Archaeology and Culture, Archaeoastronomy and Culture has shown this. And let me just, John Carlson, one of these, writes in Harsh Judgment, the public craving for esoteric apocalyptic secrets and millennial visions, ranging from catastrophic Armageddon to the dawning of an enlightened new age, are being fed, and here's a pretty good phrase, by a virtual army of these feathered snake oil salesmen, as many await the return of the plumed serpent Quetzalcoatl, the Maya Kukulkan, on December 21st, 2012. Now, this group of scholars who really have very good Maya scholars have decided that they would have a conference and they would try to figure out how did this rumor that the Maya had an apocalypse in mind or an end of time in this significant heavy way in mind when they were alive, when their culture, the classic culture, was really going. And what they came up with was that we have no record or knowledge that the Maya would think the world would come to an end in 2012, says Susan Milbrath. Willis Anders says there will be another cycle. We know the Maya thought there was one before this, and that implies they were comfortable with the idea of another one after this. So this group of scholars who went back through the scholarship for the last 50 years to try to find out where did the idea first come that the Maya themselves thought that there was going to be this apocalyptic change in 2012, and they found out where it was. The offending passage appears in Michael Coe's first version of a book called The Maya, published in 1966, that you could buy then for $2.95. He was comparing the Maya sense of time with the expansive notion of Hindu kalpas, and he writes, quote, "There is a suggestion that Armageddon would overtake the degenerate peoples of the world and all creation on the final day of the 13th Baktun. The universe will be annihilated on December 24th, 2011. He later, in another edition, he changed it to what is the more correct date, December 21st, 2012. So what they've shown is that Michael Coe, by the way, is a top-notch, very fine scholar, young at the time. He's trying to interpret this for people. It's really a trade book almost. And what he decides to do is to suggest that the Maya themselves were thinking of an Armageddon at the end of this calendar cycle. What's been shown now is that it just is not true. And the more I look at this, there's no evidence. One of the most impressive possibilities is this particular page from the Dresden Codex, which people have looked at, where you have the sky serpent and he's pouring out all this water onto the earth. And so people are saying, well, this is the great deluge, this is the end of the world, and so forth. And in fact, in a very fine article by Eric Velasquez Garcia, he really is able to contextualize this page and to show you that, in fact, in Maya thinking, in Maya communities, they were concerned periodically about cosmic changes, floods, earthquakes, and so forth, as I'm going to show you in a minute in the Aztec case. But there's no association of that with this particular date. And the only other piece of evidence that is possible, and I'm sure some of you have heard this before, comes from this Tortuguero Monument 6, where you have a text over here that is one of the few texts, one of maybe the two texts that mentions the end of the long count in 23 days. And at one point, David Stewart, who's a very fine scholar, wrote an article years ago where he used the idea of a prophecy. in relationship to this. And a lot of people picked it up in popular, and he writes now, upon more reflection, and after looking at a number of comparative examples, I now can lend my full support for Steve Houston's analysis, as well as his assertion that no prophetic statement about 2012 likely exists in Monument 6 inscription. Which leads me, to say that it's amazing how much mileage has been gotten out of this particular passage. It came from Michael Coe and has been picked up really much more in the popular press. But another scholar who looks at this, John Hoops, says this text appears to be about the investiture of a deity possibly associated with cycles of creation and rebirth. Now compare that with what I gave you from the Bible about a real apocalyptic thinking. And I think you can see why I both find this interesting, but also, I find it to be not where we should be putting our time. It looks like the next prophecy may come from this. The chief says, just take it to 2012. That's when we switch to the Dilbert calendar. And then this one, I want to make a transition here. As you'll notice in all of these all these Maya examples, they're using an Aztec stone in cartoons about the Maya calendar end time. So right here in the corner, stick in something about a company in 2012 named Facebook that releases the most successful IPO of all time, just to play with their heads. But what they're looking at is an Aztec calendar stone. He said, how come it ends in 2012? Tax-mageddon. So people are reading themselves into this, and very well. Part 3, the Aztecs did have apocalyptic cosmology. Here you have a reconstruction of the very famous Aztec sunstone called the calendar stone. And on the calendar stone, you really do have a cosmology that talks about catastrophes, one after another, and one coming in the future. I put this up here because I wanted to pay honor to Carlos Fuentes, who passed away recently. I love this photograph of Carlos, this great writer, himself a visionary, in front of the calendar stone. To also give you a sense, and this will be something happy to see by the archaeologists in the room, we look at the size and the magnificence of the work here that these people put into not a calendar stone, but a story of mythology, a story of the different visions that they had understood had been received by their ancestors over and over again. And here we find in the central part of Mexico, which is also somewhat apparent in the Maya case, that time itself was understood as accounted in the Codex Chimalpopoca, which gives us a written account of what's on, written in about the 1550s, what's on the calendar stone, that in fact they did understand the universe to have gone through 4 very powerful ages: the age of wind, the age of jaguar, the age of fire, the age of rain, and so forth. But here's the point that stands out to me. In the Aztec cosmology, each of these cosmic eras is named after the force that destroyed it, not after the force that created it. Now, I wonder how many times you could find that in other communities and other religions. But each age that the world has passed through is named and emphasizes the destructive force, the force of jaguars that came and ate us, the force of wind that blew us away, the force of rain that flooded us, and the forces of fire. So it seems to me here, you do have a cosmology, a theology. So the first age was called Sun 4 Jaguar. And what you have here is a kind of conflict between adversaries. You have Tezcatlipoca, Lord of the Smoking Mirror, and he's the one in charge until Quetzalcoatl comes and kicks him out. And there's a period of chaos. So the period of order is now caused by a fight between divinities, and it leads to a period of chaos and darkness until the second age is created, and that's named after the force that destroys it. Quetzalcoatl himself is in charge, and Tezcatlipoca makes a comeback, and he's destroyed, and the world goes into chaos. Thirdly, you have the third, which is the reign of fire, or Chalchihuitlique, one of the great goddesses, is in charge, and then Tlaloc comes, and Quetzalcoatl, and they run her out, and there's another period. So here you have a real emphasis upon repeated apocalypses and destructions. Each age is named after the force that destroyed it. The fourth age is the sun for water. But the question becomes, in terms of how apocalypse can be managed, is in the fifth age. Because on the calendar stone, there's a fifth age. That sacred number comes back to us, where the gods gathered in the darkness in Teotihuacan. And here you see a city coming back again, the great Teotihuacan. The myth says that the gods gathered in the darkness after these 4 previous destructions, and they gather in the darkness in Teotihuacan, and they try to figure out how can they recreate the universe. And what they do is they build a fire. And 2 of the gods vie for one another as to which one will throw himself into the fire. And because the belief is that out of that self-sacrifice, the sun will rise and there will be order in the universe. The 2 gods vie for one another, muy macho, and then one of them, the weaker one, throws himself into the fire. And when he throws himself into the fire, the other god then throws himself into the fire. And what happens is that they know that the sun is going to rise, but they don't know where. And Quetzalcoatl appears and he points the way. He says it's going to appear in the east. So all the gods rise up and they face the east, a place of orientation. And the sun appears, but when it appears in the east, this is what's really interesting, it wobbles from side to side. Can you imagine, for those children in the audience, a sun that appears above the horizon and it wobbles from side to side. And it wobbles from side to side because what is needed is more sacrifice. There's more sacrifice and blood that's needed, and so what happens is all the other gods then throw themselves into the fire or cut each other's throats, and then the sun moves across, and a new system, a new solar system is created, a new order, and in each of these there's an actual date with number of numbers that shows when this will take place. One of the first things that appears in the New World is a jaguar warrior and an eagle warrior. Here's the great eagle warrior that was excavated in Mexico City. That's part of this new world now, representing again the idea of the city and war are a very important part of this. The age we live in now, say the Aztecs, is the age of earthquake, because we will also be destroyed by earthquakes. We will undergo this type of, because the destiny of life is to have order, disorder, order, disorder, order, disorder, and the only way we can hold it off is through effective sacrifices, the offerings of blood, because the gods gave us blood, their blood in the beginning, to create the world in the first place, and so we have to give it back to them. Very quickly, apocalypse and other traditions. So look, it's been a crazy year. A lot of us have been to these conferences, so I was invited down to Penn, and the Penn said, look, we can't just do the Maya thing. We got to do other things. So they had Simon Martin, and he talked about Maya cataclysm. They threw me in as a token. And then they had somebody do the Inca, somebody here in the book of Revelation. Here's a guy who did the Antichrist in medieval. And then we had one on the Hindus. What's one thing about the Mesoamerican, especially the Mayan, is over the years they love to compare themselves to the Hindus. I went to these conferences years ago, and David Friedel was talking, and he was talking about how the Maya and the Hindus, and that's fine, but you ought to know something about the Hindus if you're going to talk about the Hindus. But what was left out of this conference was Buddhism. And let me just say a few things, because I wouldn't want you to go away thinking that apocalypse is really just a Western kind of thinking. It also appears in Buddhism. And it appears in Buddhism, there's some people here who know more about this than me, in the conception of Mapo, this age. The Buddhists got numbers, and they got cycles of time, and they got ages also, and they didn't get them from the Western Europeans. They didn't get them from the Europeans. They thought themselves up to it. Here you see one of the great images of one of these apocalypses or one of these destructions. Now, just to give you kind of a short sort of introduction to this, in terms of how in Buddhism the idea of apocalypse might show up. I want you to take a look at this small fragment from one of the great Japanese poets, Saigyo, in which, in very compact ways and lines, he is referencing the idea of apocalypse and also how to deal with it. He says, even in an age gone bad, the lyrics way stays straight. Not seeing this in a dream, I'd have been deaf to the truth. So in an age gone bad, that's it. That's the idea of what we're calling the idea of the degradation of time, the end of time. He's saying, I live in a time where the teaching of the Buddha is no longer effective. in the community. And therefore, the Dharma, that is the law of nature that the Buddha taught, is no longer being effectively communicated. We're in a dark time. But there's a way to deal with it. And the way to deal with it is through language, written language, poetry, the lyrics way, a certain type of poetry, a certain way of using words. An effective way of using words is the way to fight back against this dark period of history. But then he takes us back to that very early model I put up here for you, not seeing this in a dream. In other words, I had to see it. It had to appear to me. I didn't just think it up. It appeared to me in the night. And if I hadn't seen this in a dream, I would have been completely deaf to the truth. So the time had gone bad, the vision is received, the truth of how to know the Dharma is the artful use of writing. The scribe comes back. And so what you have in the Buddhist tradition, reflected in that poem, is this idea of cosmic cycles. They got their own cosmic cycles. There's 3 ages of Buddhism, 3 divisions of time following the Buddha's passing. The former day of the law sounds very much like Joachim of Fiore, but it's not. The middle day of the law, the second 1,000 years, and the latter day of the law, or Mappo. That's the concept that's very close to this notion of apocalypse. Then as time goes on, in this third period, the Buddha's teachings deteriorate, leading eventually to a long period of general misery and social unrest in some views. So what you have in some of this literature and some of this poetry is a sense by the poets, hey man, we live in a wretched time. Things have gone wrong. We live in a bad time. And there's images like this where in the cities themselves have terrible leaders. There's fires that break out. There's hurricanes that come. There's cyclones. And these are all signs, not just of bad weather. These are signs of this cosmic pattern where both humans and nature themselves have slipped away from the Dharma, from the teaching, from the pattern of the Buddha. So Buddhism and the decline of the times, what William Lafleur, in this wonderful study that he did called Awesome Nightfall, he says that in the 12th and 13th centuries of Japan's history, people were deeply absorbed in a debate as to whether the entire world had just entered a necessarily evil era called Mappo, the final epoch of the current Buddhist cycle. Many had calculated that as the year 1052. They got their number, they got their year too. The correct understanding and practice of Buddhism had been virtually non-existent. So if Buddha's teachings were no longer working, this is the time of greatest danger. And some thought that the year of 1052 was a big year, except one, the great Zen master Dogen. He argued against the Mappo theory that held that the possibility of understanding and practicing Buddhism was as good as it had ever been, and that the theories, such as that of Mappo, were merely mental contrivances by which shallow understanding and loose practice were rationalized. That's what we got to remind our students here. They come and tell me, I can't take the exam, it's just, whether you're a lousy teacher. Well, that's a contrivance. Shallow understanding. And what happens in some, not all, is that there's this whole relationship again between the city and where you got to go to get your enlightenment, where you got to go to get your apocalypse, which is a vision. Where are you going to get the revelation? Well, in some cases, you can't get it in the city. You can't get it in the city as it appears in the Hojoki. The city itself has become polluted, so you go here. You go into the mountains and you build a 10-foot square hut. And in the square hut, you meditate and you think and you dream and you open yourself to the teachings and the true meaning of impermanence as revealed not in the crazy impermanence here, but in the patterned impermanence of the hills where you can get your vision. The dust was as thick as smoke and the roar of wind so loud that none could hear the other speak. I suppose the bitter wind of karma that blows us to hell could not be more savage or fearsome, said the writer of the Hojoki before he went to the mountains to receive his revelation. And the hope is, in this dark time, they also have a salvation, that the Buddha of the future will arrive. In some traditions, the name Maitreya is the Buddha of the future. It's derived from the Sanskrit word meaning, don't we wish we had this, loving kindness. It's like Guadalupe, which in turn is derived from the noun in the sense of friend. So that in the future, in this dangerous time, the Buddha of the future will appear as a friend, full of loving kindness. And finally, I just want to tell you at the end about a book project written for children that really comes out of the imagination of my daughter Leanna, who has lived part of her life in Mexico, has visited Guatemala. And 2 years ago, when she was hearing all of this stuff about the Maya prophecy, she discovered two things. Number one, that it wasn't true. And number two, that children were already getting anxious about it. She had been anxious as a kid, I think, when the year 2000 came around and other things. And she said, no, I wanted to write a book for kids that would, number one, give them some good information about the Maya calendar. And secondly, it would also ease their fears so they don't have to be afraid. So in this story that is here beautifully illustrated by Marlo Garnsworthy, Leanna and then I helped, writes about two Mexican-American kids, 12 and 9, who are visiting their grandparents in California during the Christmas holidays. And they notice on the street, used to be an old rundown, beat up old house, has kind of been magically transformed into a museum called the Maya Calendar Museum. And they go to, there's a rainstorm and they run up to see what it is because they can't imagine this thing just magically appeared. And watching them, they don't know, is this guy called Mr. Muscles. They run up and this guy, Mr. Muscles, he jumps out and he grabs them and he says, look, you know, don't go to this museum because you don't realize that the Mayans have prophesied the end of the world. This guy is in here teaching that it's not true. It's all false. You got to join my movement. And this movement is called the End of Days Pact. So the kids get afraid. They go home to their grandparents' house and they say, hey, what's this? And the grandfather says, oh, you know, my friend, Senor Julio, he actually built this museum so that kids themselves could learn about the true meaning of the calendar end date. So they go over to the museum and they meet the granddaughter, the man who owns the museum, and they're all three Latina kids. And here they are looking at some objects that were really inspired by Jose Cuellar, Dr. Loco's visit here last year when he worked with some of the flutes that were in the Peabody Museum. And she's teaching Carlos and Lucia, this is Julia, about them. And out in the street, you see out there a protest by these people who are arguing that the end of the world is coming. And this is a really interesting character. This is a Guacamaya named Octavio. That's my daughter's brother, but she put him in as a parrot. He's there and he squawks and he says those secret things throughout. She begins, the girl, Julia, begins to teach the two visitors about the Maya calendars. And they're learning about the Maya calendars. And we put in it this image here, which is actually a copy. The idea in the story is that the Peabody Museum allowed this local people to make a copy of one of the objects in the Peabody Museum because we wanted to highlight the museum collections here. This is actually an Aztec calendar wheel that's here in the museum. And so the idea is that they're looking at this and learning about these patterns that I've taught you. And meanwhile, they learn about these symbols, the symbol of darkness and of courage. And of course, there's the Guacamaya. He's got to be in on everything. He's there looking at it. And meanwhile, what happens is one day, while they're learning about this, leading up to the 21st, a woman comes in. This is Miss Elizabeth from Pittsburgh. And she argues that the Pittsburgh is really the origins of the Maya. Now, this actually happened a couple of years ago at a phone call from the main newspaper in Pittsburgh. And they said, look, there's a whole bunch of people here that say that where the three rivers meet, that's the origin of the Maya. Is it true? I said, I don't think it's true. Let me tell you why. Well, there was a big article in the paper that Carrasco, said no. But it didn't stop them. So my daughter worked this in where Miss Elizabeth comes in from Pittsburgh and says, oh, you don't understand. This is all about Pittsburgh. This is where it's from. And so what happens is they discover through the girl who's the granddaughter that, in fact, they believe that the grandfather and the granddaughter believe that there's a portal back to the Maya world in the museum. And so they have a sleepover. And in the sleepover, the host, the girl, she's got these little obsidian mirrors. And she said, look, the Maya, if you look into this mirror, you can see where the portal is back to the Maya world. And so on the door, there's always been this poster. And this poster says Secret Maya Worlds on it. And what happens is, as the kids are watching, looking into the little obsidian mirror, they kind of get drowsy and they fall asleep, but they don't know they're asleep. And what happens is they get swooped into this tree and they fly back to Chichen Itza in the 8th century. And when they arrive back in the 8th century, they meet a Maya kid who's kind of loafing that day. He's playing. His name is Smoking Frog. So Smoking Frog is actually a historical person. Smoking Frog talks to them. Somehow they can understand each other in dreams. You know, you can understand each other. And what happens is they ask him, is the world going to end? Is it really going to end on this date? And he says, wait, no way. What are you talking about? You know, he says, but my uncle is Smoking Parrot, and he's the great daykeeper, so he'll know. So let's go see him. So they go see him, and they ask him, and he says, look, let me sing you a song. And he sings this song in which he lays out the Maya calendar is not going to bring the end of the world. But they just kind of don't quite believe it, and so they keep asking him until he gets frustrated with them and kicks them out. And when they come out, there's an eclipse. And the other Maya who've seen them think, well, these guys have caused the eclipse. So they chase them, and they run for their lives, and they just barely make it back to the tree. And they arrive back in the museum on the morning of December the 22nd, and the world hasn't ended, and they realize that they've all had the same dream. And that dreaming itself is the portal. The way you go back to the Maya world is through a portal, and that's it. And throughout the story, there's been a refrain, which Ben Leeming, who's here from the River School, which is using this book in some of his classes, he really liked. And the refrain is simply the one that the Guacamaya says, the beginning is in the end. It's not the end that is coming, but it's a new beginning. And so the book is really about this. And the book itself is something that we really enjoyed doing. We've gotten a lot of support here from the Peabody. Joan O'Donnell's and others, Andy up there have helped us think about how this book could be produced to speak to children and their families so that they could go through this experience, learn about the Maya, and also come to feel some hope in the future. It's also finally, this whole story has been picked up by a group of students and actors over in East Boston, a place called Zoomix. And they have produced a play based upon the book, only what they did is they made the Guacamaya the narrator of the play. And this play is going to be produced on December the 9th. Everybody's invited to this play. I'm actually in the play itself. I'm one of the actors, if you want to catch me. And some people from Zoomix are here. So the book that kind of grows out of this here at the Peabody Museum has shown the Peabody Museum's interest in the community, because over the last 10 years, this museum has become very active in the Latino community, and this is another example of how the community is giving back. And so we're very happy about that. And I want to thank you all for your patience. I hope you've learned something about the different views of apocalypse, and we can live on until the year 6000 AD CE. Thank you.